Giuseppe by Roderick Ford is a really interesting poem because I think it makes us consider um, what desperation can do to people. What morals are we willing to give up for survival? Um, are we willing to treat another gender, another race, another class, and so on as less than in order to better ourselves? And what's tragic is when you look at the society we live in, wherever you may be from, you can see that tragically that is still going on. Maybe not to the extent that this poem does, um, but it does occur, which is sad. It also covers the idea of guilt and regret, and arguably even embarrassment and shame. But as we go through the poem, I hope that will become apparent. So I would strongly suggest, if you don't already know what the words on the screen mean are, so allegory, ambiguity, graphic imagery, denial and regret, I would suggest you make very clear to yourselves what that means, or what they mean, sorry, and then you can go on. I think it's helpful here to consider what Ford thought about his own poem, because there's no point in me putting my own spin on it when he's basically told us what he was writing about. So he said about this poem, I was living in Paris when I wrote this poem. I'd been reading and had come across a flippant comment, a joke really, that the people of Sicily were so hungry during World War II that they ate all the fish in the aquarium, including a mermaid. I didn't find the joke funny, and felt upset for the mermaid the more I thought about her, how alone she must have been out of her element with no one to stand up for her. So I wrote the poem out of anger as much as anything else, at how monstrous people can be when they gang up on one person. And there was an interesting moral choice here too. Should the rights of the individual be sacrificed for the benefit of the collective, or should those rights be defended by the collective at all costs? For myself, I tend to think of the mermaid as representing any marginalised figure or group sacrificed in the name of expediency. For me, she is a symbol of all victims, people who are starving. If we deny the humanity of the mermaid, then we have an excuse to kill her, cut her up to feed the hungry. When people want to hurt you, they often try to portray you as some kind of other, something lesser, in her case, as only a fish. The various people who kill the mermaid symbolise the various levels of society, the fishmonger, the doctor, the priest, all of whom are serving their own self-interest in the poem. The poem is also about the perspectives of two different generations. Uncle Giuseppe represents the generation responsible for World War II, while the narrator, the niece or nephew, is of the immediate post-war generation and predisposed towards pacifism. So the poem then. So Giuseppe. My uncle Giuseppe told me that in Sicily in World War II, in the courtyard behind the aquarium, where the bougainvillea grow so well, the only captive mermaid in the world was butchered on the dry and dusty ground by a doctor, a fishmonger, and certain others. She, it, had never learned to speak because she was simple, or so they'd said. But the priest who held one of her hands while her throat was cut said she was only a fish, and fish can't speak. But she screamed like a woman in terrible fear. And when they took a ripe golden roe from her side, the doctor said that this was proof she was just a fish, and anyway, an egg is not a child, but refused when some was offered to him. Then they put her head and her hands in a box for burial, and someone tried to take her wedding ring, but the others stopped him, and the ring stayed put. The rest they cooked and fed to the troops. They said a large fish had been found on the beach. Starvation forgives men many things, my uncle, the aquarium keeper, said, but couldn't look me in the eye, for which I thank God. So as you read back through that poem and, potentially go back and listen to me read it again, what do you consider the story to be? Who is the speaker? Who is the narrator? What is their relationship between Giuseppe and so on? And what kind of powerful images are being presented there? This is quite a lovely poem in that it is quite deep in some of its ideas, and it really does make you think about your own views and your own morality. So the story is the speaker recounts his uncle's story of how in Sicily during World War II, a group of people participated in the murder of a mermaid in order to save the soldiers from starvation. At the end of the poem, it is revealed that the uncle is the aquarium keeper, which highlights his significant role in the mermaid's death. Because if you think about it, the uncle gave the other men the keys to the aquarium. That's how they got to the mermaid slash woman. In terms of themes and ideas, obviously you've got the theme of transgression. The theme is key in the poem with dark ideas and suggestions running throughout which transgress typical human boundaries as a result of the setting and situation of the time. You've also got the theme of conflict. The way in which the war forces these inhumane acts is quite striking and emphasises the brutality of warfare. And finally, you've got the idea of power. Every person mentioned is male except the mermaid, who is female. It is interesting that all of the men deny the rights of this female. Whether she's a mermaid or a woman, it doesn't really matter. It's all men making a decision for a female. And again, you've got to consider that idea in the poem. So the poem is called Giuseppe, and that creates quite a personal tone. It's the name of the it's the name of the speaker's uncle. So it may create a sense of alienation for us, as in the reader, through the use of Italian dialects, potentially, establishing a sense of otherness and difference. I would argue it more creates the idea of the personal tone and, this idea of knowledge. This is, I don't want to say a first-hand account, but kind of we're hearing it from the niece or nephew, the story that they were told. So second-hand knowledge, but, it still makes it more personal than other poems we read. My uncle Giuseppe told me that in Sicily in World War II. So we've got a clear setting, we've got a clear time frame. We know when this was going on. And we also have the theme of conflict. Again, second line, we're told, kind of set in World War II. In the courtyard behind the aquarium where the bougainvillea grows so well. Now, that word that I definitely cannot say correctly, bougainvillea, I'm not entirely sure, is a type of beautiful flower, which is possibly why I don't know it. I am not a gardener. But it gives this image of life and vitality and beauty. So in this courtyard behind this aquarium where this hell essentially goes down, it's beautiful and lively and vibrant and all this thing, which only makes what occurs next worse. The only captive mermaid in the world was butchered on the dry and dusty ground by a doctor, a fishmonger, and certain others. So you've got the idea of the brutality and the violence there. Butchered, that verb butchered is really quite dark, I suppose. And then you've got the harsh consonant, the dry and dusty. There is no love lost here. This is not a nice image at all. This is meant to be a horrible death for this poor mermaid. You've also got the idea that obviously it's a mermaid. It introduces the idea of the fantasy, which juxtaposes from the very historical, true setting of World War II. And to put both of those combined in a poem is quite interesting, and we'll maybe discuss that later about why that might be. And the listing of the perpetrators, doctor, a fishmonger, and certain others. One, all men, or we certainly learn later they're all men, but two, the uncle is listing these people. So again, I don't want to say passing the buck, but he's certainly listing all of the murderers that kind of, I don't want to say co-conspirators, they would be co-defendants if they were ever going to be tried, put it that way. These are all the baddies that have done this to the poor little mermaid. It had never learned to speak because she was simple, or so they'd said. So you've got the juxtaposition of the pronouns there. You've got the she, and then you've got the it. It's really dehumanising her. And then we've got the she was simple, or so they'd said. There's this sense of doubt, and this established doubt continues throughout the rest of the poem. And note the caesura. It creates that pause. So she was simple, pause, or so they'd said. That pause is deliberate. It's meant to make you consider, well, are they telling the truth? Or are they just telling us what they think we want to hear, because then no one has to feel guilty? But the priest who held one of her hands while her throat was cut said she was only a fish. So you've got the idea of the priest and their role of, religion and justification, etc. But he's holding some hands, which I don't know if you know anything about fish, but they don't have hands, and they don't particularly have throats. So he's holding hands, a throat is cut, but the priest is saying it's fine, whatever, she was only a fish. It's quite clearly, it humanises then dehumanises her repeatedly. It's this idea that no one seems to really give an on, you know, it may very well be that she is human, and then yet she's only a fish. And if you've got to think about a mermaid is, you know, half human, half fish. They seem to only be advocating for the idea that she is full fish. And fish can't speak, but she screams like a woman in terrible fear. That simile there almost rehumanises her. And again, it develops a sense of unease and doubt. We feel sympathy for her, and it is the only explicit reference to emotion in the whole poem. And the only emotion is terrible fear, which again tells you how sad and how sympathetic we should be to her. And when they took a ripe golden roe from her side, the doctor said that this was proof she was just a fish. And anyway, an egg is not a child, but refused when some was offered to him. So I've put questions on the slide there for you, but I am going to sort of talk kind of through the stanzas as I go anyway. So obviously a golden roe is a fish egg. The idea that it's golden suggests potentially rarity or purity or just greatness, preciousness, if you want. And so they cut this out of her, and this was proof she was just a fish, because obviously only fish can have roe, humans have children. But the doctor refuses some when it's offered. Why? Why? Because people do eat fish eggs. That's, you know, what some people are into, but the doctor refuses. So potentially again, he's justified to everyone else that yeah, sure, she's just a fish. But maybe he still feels guilty. There is a level of guilt and shame to him that he does not want any part of her, it, if you will. Then they put her head and hands in a box for burial, and someone tries to take her wedding ring, but the others stopped him, and the ring stayed put. It's interesting that we never know who the perpetrator is of the stealing of the wedding ring, or the attempted removal of the wedding ring. But the others stop him. Well, why would the others stop him? If they cared, you know, they wouldn't have killed her, potentially. Or maybe they, you know, again, feel guilt and shame at what they've done. And you've got to consider the idea of a wedding ring being a symbol of love between one and another. But if she's married, someone's missing a woman slash mermaid. So again, what are they killing here? And the ring stay put. They leave the ring there. I think that's potentially their way of letting her remain somewhat human. They are humanizing her. You are humanized in marriage bliss. The rest they cooked and fed to the troops. They said a large fish had been found on the beach. So they cook her up, feed her out, but they lie to all the soldiers. They never tell the soldiers about the idea that she was a mermaid. And you've got to consider why that would be. Is it because they know that potentially the soldiers wouldn't eat her? Potentially because they know that, what a ridiculous story. If someone told me they'd found a mermaid in the Thames, I'd be like, okay. How do I know you haven't just murdered someone? So things like that. So you've got to consider why they are deliberately omitting the truth there. They're deliberately lying to the troops. Maybe they don't want to put the guilt onto them. And also consider the irregular structure of this. Everything else has been one type of stanza, and now we're into a couplet here. Moving on. Starvation forgives men many things, my uncle, the aquarium keeper said. So this is when we realise the uncle is the aquarium keeper, right at the end of the poem. And the idea that he said starvation forgives men many things, it's this idea that he is trying desperately to justify what he did. And you've got to consider what lengths you would go. If you were truly starving, what would you do? Would you just sit there and take it, or would you do heinous, maybe not heinous, but, you know, things you wouldn't ordinarily do just to survive? And people do. Do awful things to survive. But this uncle can't look the niece or nephew, you know, the narrator, in the eye, for which I thank God. And you can see that in the way that you could argue that that's potentially that he feels guilt. This uncle feels guilt, and the narrator is grateful for that, because at least then there is a guilt there, and there is a shame there Because if there wasn't, and if he was quite brazen about it, it's like, yeah, yeah, we killed a mermaid. Wasn't 100% sure she was a mermaid or a fish or a woman, but you got to do what you got to do. But this guy doesn't. He cannot look the narrator in the eye, and that demonstrates um, that there is a guilt there. And the idea that the narrator also says, "For which I thank God," shows that this next generation is grateful for the passivity and the lack of war and they don't want this tension and this hell to go on. In terms of key structural features, the idea that you've got is that it's free verse using some reported speech that we hear from many of the characters in there. It adds a level of personalisation through the quite conversational tone, but there is also an element of distance because we are hearing this third hand third hand, and adds to the uncertainty and ambiguity. Because by the way, it's like Chinese whispers. Once you've heard it from one person, then that person hears it from another person, and so on. You don't know what's true and what's not. It's quite a confessional tone throughout the poem, and it juxtaposes realism with fantasy. There is a frequent use of caesura, typically used to contradict or cast doubt in the reader's mind, suggesting guilt and denial and so on. And there is an irregular structure, and use of enjambment creates a sense of chaos, of frenzy. There is no clear rhythm and pace to the poem, reflecting the conversational style, but it could also hint at the feelings of guilt that have transferred from Giuseppe to the speaker. And the exam board have said about this, the disturbing poem blends historical realism with a fairy tale element to explore the darkest corners of human behaviour. Their strategy is to deny her any humanity. They talk of proof, using her physical difference and supposed mental incapacity as an excuse for what they do. In this, they recall the arguments set forth by the Nazi regime and other totalitarian authorities throughout history, bent on establishing racial superiority. However, the poem undermines their arguments at key points and demonstrates the perpetrators are lying to themselves. The doctor won't eat the roe offered to him. Most disturbing is the revelation that she was married, that she had crossed into the human world of love and might have expected protection from harm. No one could quite bring themselves to remove the wedding ring, despite the desecration of her body. What the poem demonstrates succinctly is the lasting effect of atrocity on a community, for this is an event in which an entire village is implicated. While the violence is carried out by key members of the community, most disturbingly perhaps the doctor, no one else, including the narrator's uncle, tried to intervene. This collective guilt, the poem implies, is seeping into the next generation. We can sense it in the compulsion of the narrator to tell his uncle's story and in their inability to look each other in the eye. The poem ends on the word God, reminding us of how far the protagonists have moved outside moral boundaries. And I read a lovely essay the other week about how Ford argued that there are similarities between the presentation of the mermaid and the idea of Jesus Christ. And the idea that both of them, the mermaid and Christ, are forced to accept their own sacrifice in order to save others. Whether you want to go along with that argument or not is entirely up to you, but I thought that was quite an interesting idea that Ford brought about there. In terms of model paragraph, I just did how did Ford present the theme of denial in this poem? So at the start of the poem, Ford establishes the theme of denial through the juxtaposition of realism and fantasy, employed by Giuseppe's reported speech. The use of the historical setting, Sicily during World War II, and the fairy tale imagery, only captive mermaid, immediately suggests that the reader cannot entirely trust the poetic voice, and highlights how the perpetrators of this crime have had to lie to themselves in order to justify the atrocities they committed during the war. This is furthered through the conflicting pronouns she, it, which dehumanize the mermaid to continue to defend or rationalize their actions. However, the caesura creates a pause which hints at the uncertainty and doubt of Giuseppe that what they did can be morally justified. In terms of further support and taking it further, obviously I've got the websites there for you. An additional task that you might want to use to develop your ideas: what is the possible symbolic significance of the mermaid? Like, why a mermaid? Why is that the thing? Why do you think the poet chose to write the poem in this style? So again, consider that. And then what is the significance of there only being one simile in the poem?